This is our world, and there lies the United States of America, the most powerful military force the world has seen. And they have a lot of bombs, and sometimes they are not afraid to send them across the globe. These are all the countries that the US has bombed since the Second World War. The first stop of our journey is the Korean Peninsula. It is the year 1950, and the war between the communist North and the capitalist South is escalating into massive destruction. In the 3 years of war, the US dropped a total of 635,000 tons of bombs on North Korea. An estimated 85% of its buildings were destroyed, and more than 280,000 North Koreans died during the bombings. Few bombs even hit the Chinese land and bridges over the Yalu River, so the USA technically bombed China as well. The next bomber jet that followed an order from the US president didn't have to fly that far. His target was right behind the corner, Guatemala City. After the revolution in Guatemala, the new government was, let's say, tolerant of the communists. That was enough for the US to plan a coup, which was accompanied by the bombing of Guatemala City and ended with a success, letting to power the leader of the coup, Carlos Castillo Armas, the future dictator of Guatemala. Changing the continent again, our next stop is Indonesia and the year 1957. President Eisenhower didn't like the amount of communism in Indonesia, led by President Sukarno. So he ordered the CIA to change the course of Indonesia. They militarized several rebellious groups with the task of overthrowing the government. But the word got out. American involvement was discovered and rebels were quickly defeated by the Indonesian army. Meanwhile, desperate CIA agents fleeing the country bombed Indonesia's outer islands, striking military and civilian targets and killing hundreds of innocent people. It was a huge failure for the USA, and in the coming years, it wasn't the only one. Hopping back to America, the next bomb is going to land on the biggest Caribbean island, Cuba. After a successful revolution, Fidel Castro gets to power. A communist Castro nationalized American businesses, which was enough for Eisenhower to plan yet another coup. CIA got the order and launched the attack. On April 17, 1961, the ground force landed in the Bay of Pigs. Meanwhile, the first and last air support came 2 days earlier, when 8 B-26 bombers had bombed many of the Cuban airfields. President J.F. Kennedy, now in the office, didn't allow any further air support, without which was the ground force defeated within 3 days. The invasion was a US foreign policy failure and solidified Castro's role as a national hero, also setting Cuba closer to the Soviet Union. Quickly returning to the lovely Guatemala, which still hasn't found peace yet. Since the last bombing, it has been widely misused by the USA for training forces and launching the attack on Cuba. The money flowing from the US came straight to the pocket of General Irigoyen Fuente, who got to the power after the assassination of Castillo Armas. In 1957, young officers, angered by the corruption, decided to revolt, and the possibility of a coup led the USA to a decision to bomb the rebel bases. And it worked. The rebellion was calm for a moment, but at the same time, this was the starting point of a long 46 years of civil wars in Guatemala. Here we go again, jumping right back from where we came a moment ago, Vietnam. War between North Vietnam, supported by communists, and South Vietnam, supported by capitalists. Kinda familiar scheme. We call this situation a proxy war, which means that two superpowers are using other countries as their battleground. Estimate says that the USA alone dropped more than 4 million tons of explosives during the war. The bombing of Vietnam thus went down in history as the longest and heaviest aerial bombardment ever. And we will stay in the region for a while, as the Vietnam War spread into neighboring countries as well. Only in Laos, the USA dropped around 2 million tons of bombs. CIA once again gave guns to a Hmong minority and ignited a conflict between them and the communist government. By 1975, 1/10 of population of Laos, or 200,000 people, was dead. The United States eventually dropped the equivalent of a plane load of bombs every 8 minutes, 24 hours a day for 9 years straight. Approximately 80 million bombs didn't explode and are causing casualties until today. The last stop to complete our South Asian triangle is Cambodia, another victim of the Vietnam War. The US Secretary of State Henry Kissinger claimed that Cambodia was used as a sanctuary for communist insurgents, and the order he gave to his deputy speaks for all. He wants a massive bombing campaign in Cambodia. It's an order. It's to be done. Anything that flies on anything that moves. You got that? And as a result, as many as 150,000 civilians died. And we are in the tropical Caribbean again. This time, the target is a small island called Grenada. The USA invaded this country in 1983 after a communist rise on the island. Their reasons were to protect American citizens, as well as to prevent what they perceived as a Soviet-Cuban expansion in the region. The invasion involved airstrikes, naval bombardment, and ground assault by US and other Caribbean forces. As a result, 45 Grenadinian soldiers were killed, together with at least 24 civilians. With the 80s came two things: the big hair and the Middle East. More specifically, in 1983 came one of the first USA bombings in this region. The target was Beirut. During the peak of an ongoing civil war, two suicidal trucks bombed barracks in Beirut, killing 241 US and 58 French military personnel. The USA and France decided to answer by bombing suspected Hezbollah militants, which were at the time believed to be trained by Iran forces. Terrorist militias such as Hezbollah are active in Lebanon until today.
How do you handle the threat to your life?
Oh, I don't know. Maybe I don't think about it.
Let's move only a little bit to the west, but not leaving the wider region. Operation El Dorado Canyon was conducted in Libya after a bombing of a discotheque in West Berlin, which killed 2 American servicemen. President Ronald Reagan concluded that Libyan agents in East Berlin had been responsible for the explosion, and thus he launched a 12-minute bombing of military targets as well as a residential compound where the Libyan leader Muammar al-Gaddafi lived. In total, 60 tons of munitions were dropped. However, Gaddafi escaped the bombing alive. During the 80s, a lot was happening in Central America. Most of the countries were in the middle of civil wars, and the US was always present. It intervened in the regime in El Salvador and Nicaragua, but both escaped the bombing, which is not true for Panama. In 1989, the USA invaded Panama with the ultimate goal to depose the Panamanian dictator Manuel Noriega, who was wanted by US authorities for racketeering and drug trafficking. The invasion was accompanied by a bombing of military installations and government buildings associated with the regime. Operation Just Cause resulted in Noriega's capture and imprisonment, thus with a successful democratization, one of the successes of the USA, which will not be easily repeated in the following years. At this point, Central America seems to be at least partially protected from communism. Meanwhile, the tension rises very quickly in the middle of the East, which will fully unwrap in the ongoing years. At this point, Saddam Hussein had already been terrorizing Iraq for 12 years, and now he felt the urge to project its power abroad. So he invaded Kuwait, which the world did not like at all and quickly responded by a US-led Operation Desert Storm, a massive aerial bombardment of Iraqi military targets. The airstrikes were followed by a ground offensive, which ultimately led to the liberation of Kuwait and a big loss for Saddam. Changing the continent, but not traveling far, we arrive in Mogadishu, Somalia, a country that was decimated by a civil war, leaving most of the people starving to death. That's why the United Nations decided to step in and start a humanitarian mission. Because the mission often faced attacks by militant groups, the US decided to intervene and send soldiers to protect the peace workers. When the attacks didn't stop, the US and UN troops were given a task to capture the leader of the rebels, Muhammad Farah Aidid. During this mission, they attacked and bombed a lot of targets associated with Aidid's forces. They eventually apprehended several high-ranking Aidid associates, but with a high cost in human lives. The units were withdrawn soon after, leaving the country in clan warfare. And there goes another bloody war, and the USA is involved as always. Bosnia and Herzegovina came about as a result of the breakup of Yugoslavia. This multi-ethnic, multi-religious war was fought by many militant groups. The main ones were Bosniaks, aka Bosnian Muslim forces, then Bosnian Serb forces and Bosnian Croat forces. This complicated situation escalated to the point when the UN and NATO decided to step in and conduct airstrikes in 1995 as part of Operation Deliberate Force. The campaign struck 338 Bosnian Serb targets, many of which were destroyed. Very unique situation occurred in Khartoum, the capital city of Sudan, in 1998, where the USA bombed a pharmaceutical factory. The US government claimed that it was involved in the production of chemical weapons, with links to Osama bin Laden, the leader of Al-Qaeda, a terrorist organization that was behind bombings of American embassies in Kenya and Tanzania in the same year. Despite that, the legitimacy of the attack in Sudan has been controversial and debated. Within the same mission, called Operation Infinite Reach, the US also dropped a few bombs in Afghanistan. These were some of the first US efforts to fight global terrorism. The targets were Al-Qaeda's training camps in Afghanistan. The goal was to weaken the organization and kill Osama bin Laden. However, he was not present there, and the result of the bombing was death of 5 Pakistani inter-service intelligence officers who were training militias to fight in Kashmir. Meanwhile, in Europe, the 90s were shaken by a war in Balkans. Ethnicities and religions were the main reasons behind the endless years of wars. That's why the USA, along with NATO allies, conducted airstrikes in Yugoslavia, or in what was left of it, in 1999 as part of Operation Allied Force. The primary reason for the bombings was to stop the ethnic cleansing and atrocities committed by Serbian forces against ethnic Albanians in Kosovo. The main targets of the airstrikes were Serbian military targets in Kosovo and throughout Yugoslavia, mostly today's Serbia. As the following years went, the war against terrorism was beginning to gain momentum, especially after tragic events in September 2001. Another target was Yemen, significant hub for the terrorist organization's activities in the Arabian Peninsula. In November 2002, 6 Yemeni suspected Al-Qaeda members were blown up in their car, and since we are already in Yemen, why not attack it on a regular basis? Since 2010, the US bombed or attacked many people and military camps associated with Al-Qaeda in Yemen. The most recent bombing was at the start of the year 2024. Coming back to Iraq, a troubled nation that suffered a similar fate. During the years after the Gulf War, the US and UK airstrikes in Iraq were on a yearly basis. One of the bigger ones came in 1998. The 4-day bombing followed Iraq's failure to comply with United Nations inspectors who were looking for weapons of mass destruction and were repeatedly refused access to certain sites in Iraq. But that wasn't the end. In 2003, the world had enough of Saddam Hussein's Iraq. Therefore, the USA-led coalition invaded Iraq, known as Operation Iraqi Freedom, with the stated goal of removing Saddam Hussein from power and eliminating Iraq's alleged weapons of mass destruction. The invasion began on March 20, 2003. It involved extensive airstrikes and ground operations, which ended up as a success. US troops were officially withdrawn in 2011. However, the United States became re-involved in 2014 as the head of a new coalition, and since then Iraq still remains unstable, which creates space for the growth of terrorist organizations. In February 2024, the United States launched airstrikes in Iraq and Syria against more than 85 targets linked to Iran's Revolutionary Guard and other militias considered as terrorist organizations by the USA. When we roll back to 2001, the biggest terrorist threat lay in Afghanistan. Following the 9/11 attacks carried out by Al-Qaeda, which was led by Osama bin Laden, the USA demanded that the Taliban regime in Afghanistan, which harbored Al-Qaeda, hand over bin Laden and remove terrorist training camps. However, the Taliban is the Taliban, and it refused to comply with these demands, which left the USA with the only option: invasion. One of the biggest USA campaigns, called Operation Enduring Freedom, started in 2001 and lasted until the end of 2014. However, the USA withdrew its last troops from Afghanistan in 2021, and as you can expect, the operation included a lot of bombing. Since the USA successfully suppressed the Taliban at least for the 20-year period, it didn't just disappear. Most of the Taliban fighters, together with Al-Qaeda, moved to the Pakistani border, which also dragged Pakistan into the conflict and caused a repeated bombing of its territory by the US. However, these military actions have been carried out with the cooperation of the Pakistani government, which has allowed US drone strikes and other operations against militant targets on its territory. And yet, there is another haven for terrorist organizations, which is once again Somalia, with the rise of a local Islamist military group called Al-Shabaab. The US decided to take matters into their own hands. Since 2007, it has conducted airstrikes to degrade Al-Shabaab's capabilities and disrupt its operations while supporting the Somali government, which is in direct conflict with the militant group. Further, in 2010, Al-Shabaab declared an alliance with Al-Qaeda, and so this conflict continues until today, with the last airstrike at the beginning of 2024. And still, we remain in this troubled region, moving to Libya, which was in 2011 hit by big waves of protests as a part of a wider Arab Spring movement across the Middle East and North Africa. Libyans, already fed up with Muammar Gaddafi's dictatorship, went to the streets and started the Libyan civil war. The protests escalated into a full-scale armed conflict as Gaddafi's forces launched a brutal attack including civilian targets. The USA and NATO decided to launch Operation Unified Protector, targeting Gaddafi's military targets, which weakened the regime and ultimately led to his overthrow. However, the newly created power vacuum led to the rise of instability and gave power to militant groups. A terrorist organization called Islamic State was one of those that started to thrive in this type of environment. That was alarming for the US. That's why it decided to intervene and carried out a large series of both airstrikes and drone strikes in support of Libyan government. The same reason was behind the bombing of Syria in 2014, as it was full of military camps of ISIL or ISIS or simply Islamic State, which are basically all the same. These were the subject of bombing. In the next years, a lot of similar airstrikes followed, not only from the US but also from other world military powers. The last one was part of the bombing of Iraq at the start of this year, as the targets of the bombing, the military camps of Iran's Revolutionary Guards, are present in both countries. And here we are today, in a world where military power is still the main driving factor. And it seems that it will stay like that for the coming years. I'm sure that I didn't cover all of the bombings that happened. However, my goal was to mention the most significant ones with the reasons behind them. To learn more, continue to this video next. Thanks for watching.